This hearing is called to order. Welcome to all the witnesses. Thank you for being here. Today's hearing is the second in a series of hearings focused on the future of the International Space Station. During the previous hearing, this subcommittee received testimony from government witnesses who cast considerable doubt on the administration's proposal to end federal support of the International Space Station in 2025. In our hearing, not only did NASA confirm that the International Space Station has operational life through at least 2028, if not longer, but NASA's Inspector General raised significant concerns that it is not only quite unlikely that a private entity or entities would assume the station's annual operating costs, but also, quote, any assumption that ending direct federal funding would free up $3 billion to $4 billion in 2025 for use on other NASA initiatives is wishful thinking. I agree with the concerns that NASA's Inspector General has raised to this subcommittee. The concerns and the confirmation from NASA that the ISS has operational life well beyond 2025 should not be taken lightly by members of this committee or by the National Space Council. American taxpayers have invested roughly $100 billion in the International Space Station, and it is my firm belief that it would be irresponsible for the United States government to prematurely end the life of the International Space Station before maximizing American taxpayer investment. We should not throw away that very significant investment of resources from the taxpayers and also from our allies. It is concerning that some have argued during this debate that the rationale for ending direct funding of the ISS is that the United States cannot afford both continued ISS operations and deep space exploration at the same time. I disagree that this is an either-or decision. And Congress has demonstrated a strong bipartisan commitment to NASA and to our human spaceflight programs through significant increases in appropriations over the last several fiscal years to ensure both a healthy low Earth orbit and deep space exploration program. What's clear is we cannot afford to continue to pursue policies that have the consequences of creating gaps in capability, or that send $3.5 billion in taxpayer money to the Russian government because we failed to plan to have adequate tools to reach low Earth orbit. Nor can we create a leadership vacuum in low Earth orbit that provides a window of opportunity for the Chinese to capitalize upon as they look to have an operational space station in low Earth orbit in 2022. As long as I am chairman of the Space Subcommittee, the ISS will continue to have strong and bipartisan support in the United States Senate. In the past several years, we've passed two major pieces of space legislation working cooperatively, Republicans and Democrats, in support of space. One that was signed by President Obama, one that was signed by President Trump. The purpose of today's hearing is to receive testimony from non-governmental ISS stakeholders who can provide Congress with their firsthand experience interacting with the ISS and what the impact would be for commercial stakeholders, even those looking at building a successor to the ISS, which we will need one day, but we should not prematurely disregard the investment we have made into it. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony and will now recognize our subcommittee's ranking member, Senator Markey, for his opening statement. Thank you, Senator Nelson. And I'll make a point to observers that one of the things that I think is striking across the opening statements, there are many issues on which Senator Markey, Senator Nelson, and I might disagree. But when you have unanimity across the partisan spectrum, across the ideological spectrum, when you're hearing the exact same thing from conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats, that the ISS...
Moderate Democrats. Moderate Democrats.
I will let folks self-identify as they choose. I didn't say nutcase lefties. I kept it. Everyone can self-identify on that spectrum, and even our friendly libertarians in Colorado. I mean, we've got a full spectrum, and yet what there's agreement across that spectrum is that the ISS is a critical asset to the United States of America. It is a tremendous asset for scientific research, for innovation, for discovery. The American taxpayers have invested $100 billion into it. Our allies have invested billions and billions of dollars into it. And it would be foolish to waste that investment, to cut it short, to invent an arbitrary deadline like 2025 and say, never mind that we have additional good productive use out of it, we're going to plunge our head into the sand and throw away that asset. That is the height of foolishness, and this is a message that should be heard. It should be heard by every contractor, everyone doing business with the ISS, by every researcher who has an idea for a new innovation on the ISS, and by our allies, our partners in the ISS, that whatever might be put in an OMB proposal, it remains the Congress of the United States that authorizes programs and that appropriates programs. And when you see bipartisan unanimity in support of the ISS, the position of the United States government should be clear and unambiguous. And part of the reason why you see that unanimity is because of what we're hearing from the leaders at NASA, from the stakeholders about the science and the potential future. And this panel is an excellent representation of those with deep expertise and knowledge. And so with that, I'm going to introduce each of the four witnesses. Mr. Michael Suffredini is the president and CEO of Axiom Space. Axiom plans to launch 2 commercial modules in 2021, setting the stage for the first commercial space station in low Earth orbit. Prior to Axiom, Mr. Suffredini served for 10 years at NASA as the manager of the International Space Station. In that role, Mr. Suffredini spearheaded the transition of ISS from development and assembly to research and commercial utilization. He managed a 15-nation team and a $3 billion budget, which was the largest international peacetime project in the history of humanity. Mr. Bob Mitchell, a longtime friend, is the president of the Bay Area Houston Economic Partnership. He has served in this role since 2008. When he first joined the partnership in 2000, Mr. Mitchell oversaw the statewide implementation of the State Space Alliance Technology Outreach Program. Prior to that, Mr. Mitchell gained extensive experience during his 15 years at Grumman Aerospace Corporation, now known as Northrop Grumman. As an executive at Grumman, Mr. Mitchell directed all production, engineering, and material operations for the Houston facility. Mr. Jim Chilton is Senior Vice President of the Space and Launch Division of Boeing Defense, Space, and Security. His portfolio includes the International Space Station, the CST-100 Starliner commercial crew vehicle, NASA's Space Launch System, government and commercial satellite systems, and Boeing's participation in United Launch Alliance. Previously, Mr. Chilton served as Vice President and Program Manager for Exploration Launch Systems and led SLS, Boeing's heavy lift launch vehicle program. And finally, Ms. Cynthia Buteau, who is Director of the Commercial Innovation and Sponsored Programs at the Center for the Advancement of Science and Space, also known as CASIS. Ms. Buteau heads a team of business development professionals that focus on generating flight projects for the ISS National Lab in the life science, energy, chemicals, materials, clean tech, and IT sectors. Prior to her current position, Ms. Buteau was president of the Collaborative Innovation Group, an organization focused on providing the tools and methodologies to establish successful product offerings developing efficient routes to market, and building image and brand. And with that, we'll start the testimony. We'll begin with you, Mr. Suferdini. Thank you very much, Ms. Buteau. Let's start with questioning Mr. Chilton. Based on the technical study and the report that Boeing produced for NASA on the lifespan of the International Space Station, what's your assessment of the real lifespan of the station, and how can we fully leverage this investment to get the maximum return on the platform?
Our assessment of lifespan of station with all the calculations complete is to 2028. In the course of doing that, we saw no technical showstoppers to extend her life significantly. I mentioned previously the 2030s seem very reasonable. I'd like to point out that as we've improved in partnership with NASA the capability of the station, I mentioned it's a better platform today than 10 years ago. The natural upgrade and improvement process in the course of maintenance should take all the subsystems that are not structured just as reasonably.
So from a scientific and technical perspective, you don't see any significant barriers to going to at least 2028 and potentially 2030 or beyond. Is that right?
That's correct, Senator.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask a question to all the witnesses. What do you think could be the unintended consequences of terminating federal funding for ISS in 2025, 5 years potentially before the end of its usable life? And I'll open that up to anyone.
I don't mind starting. I think we could signal to the science community some uncertainty, and we could see science dry up. I think we could signal to the entrepreneurial community who may need more time, and we could see capital dry up. I think we could, I'll use the term head fake. We could have some people start something, and as we go down this path, they've invested some capital and they find it's not going to work out because we're not certifying the life extension using government dollars. And frankly, I think the transportation costs are a bit of an elephant in the room. Everybody who's able to generate revenue on ISS today is having government-sponsored transportation back and forth, so that's got to be solved.
And I would just add, the entrepreneurial community, the commercial community, when they look at doing research on station, they're not looking at a one-shot deal. They're looking at a research roadmap. Especially when we're talking about our pharmaceutical companies that are doing work, we're talking about a 10-year time frame. They do not want to see a trajectory that does not meet their research roadmap. We've already had anecdotal evidence of companies that we're working with to try to get to station hesitate once that 2025 date was announced.
And if we get to 2025 and the only space station in low Earth orbit is being operated by China, is that good for the United States of America?
You know, Congressman, that's exactly what I was going to add to the conversation, is that our biggest concern as well needs to be the international relationships that we've developed all these years, develop the collaboration, look at the relationship that we continue to have today with Russia, even though we know what's going on in the world. This is the one thing that has really pulled us all together, kept us focused and working together. To give that up to China would be devastating, in my opinion.
So I'd like to add, I lived through ISS for many, many years since the beginning. And during that process, I was involved in the decision process from the outside of watching us decide that we would retire shuttle and have commercial crew. And it didn't really turn out the way we had all talked about, which really was you had to bring on a commercial crew provider and then let shuttle retire. And we are seriously suffering the consequences today. That we are relying on another country to get us to orbit, get our crews to orbit and back is a travesty. If we are going to lead, which this country only should be doing, we need to do it by making the right commitments and making sure our transitions are sound. We need to stay in space. We have to be there. That's the high ground. That's where we need to be. And we need to do it with other countries as well. That's critically important for us as well. So to lose the ISS without having some other capability orbit that is American-made, I think it'd be a huge mistake.
So if I understand your testimony, you're saying before we wind down any platform that history has taught us we need to have a reliable alternative in place first so that we're not left with nothing and a lack of capability and a vulnerability to other nations.
That is of critical importance. Yes, sir.
Mr. Mitchell, you and I are both Houstonians. What impact does the Johnson Space Center have on economic development and jobs in and around Houston? And what would happen if NASA were to prematurely cancel a large program like ISS or to reduce mission control at JSC?
Well, NASA has a tremendous impact from an economic development standpoint. Today, there's currently $1.4 billion in salaries that go through the Johnson Space Center. But more importantly, I need to set up the answer to that question by stating a few facts, and that is that in 2012, the Johnson Space Center had 18,294 employees. Today, we have less than 11,000 employees. Today, currently, there's a little over 4,700 that are working on the International Space Station. I hate to use the same term as I used a few minutes ago, but it would be devastating to the community and to the space program to cut our number of people working for NASA supporting the International Space Station. That would put us down to less than 5,000 people. So it would be devastating to the community.
Okay, thank you. My final question, Ms. Buteau, is directed to you. Your written testimony highlights that more than 55% of payloads to the National Lab are private sector customers, and that includes projects from iconic Fortune 500 companies and also from innovative startups. Some of the examples of research that have been conducted on the ISS include Goodyear is using microgravity to better understand silica morphology for the manufacturing of new tires with low rolling resistance that are more fuel efficient and safer. Casis Materials states that, quote, research could give Goodyear a competitive advantage in the tire industry by developing superior rubber materials. Likewise, Procter & Gamble is using microgravity to understand complex fluid behavior and to improve the functionality and shelf life of consumer personal care products such as shampoo, shaving cream, and gelatin. Merck is using microgravity to grow a crystalline suspension of millions of tiny uniform crystals to improve the formulation of the company's cancer immunotherapy drug, Keytruda. Keytruda is the drug that helped former President Jimmy Carter's cancer go into remission. And Forbes has reported that some analysts predict that Keytruda may be Merck's next $10 billion drug. Now, Ms. Buteau, tell me, to what extent do American taxpayers receive direct payments or benefits from the research that's being conducted by Fortune 500 companies that may give them a competitive advantage in their respective industries?
That's an excellent question, and we were just with Paul Reichert, the researcher from Merck, yesterday talking about the Keytruda drug at the Bio Conference, and I have to say that Merck is one of the biggest spokes companies and advocates for doing research in space. I would step back and point to the work that we have done to quantify value and impact back to the American taxpayer. We have looked at best practice analogs around what are the economic, the innovation, and the humankind social benefits. Those were the numbers I was quoting around the $900 million of incremental revenue, the $110 billion of total addressable market, the acceleration and time to market. These are some examples of those broader economic impacts that are coming back to the American taxpayer. When you mentioned Goodyear with the tires, not only are there going to be return on investments to Goodyear from tire sales and being a leader in their industry, but those tires are going to result in lower emissions. I've got another, which is a humankind benefit. We've got other examples like Delta Faucet, which is looking at shower heads. And again, their project may result to Delta Faucet and their product, but the point is, how do you make a better water efficient tool that, again, can look at these broader humankind benefits? So we've done a lot of work looking at best practice analogs to understand how we can best communicate that overall value of economic innovation and humankind benefit back to the country, in addition to what the individual organizations are doing in terms of benefiting from that work on station.
Well, thank you for your testimony. I think that was helpful. If I understood you right, though, you said that there would be benefits to humanity from new technologies, and those are certainly real and cognizable. At the same time, there's not currently a revenue stream coming to the taxpayers if a $10 billion drug is developed on the ISS, that revenue, that profit is not going back to the taxpayers. I know I, and I think other members of this committee, are interested in working with stakeholders and thinking about whether it makes sense for the taxpayers to enjoy some of the upside. We see many of our large research universities that innovate in science and enjoying the upside from the innovations they receive, and I think that has the potential over the long term to help provide additional funding streams for deep space exploration and for continued American leadership in space. So that will be a continued topic of discussion among members of this committee and stakeholders throughout the industry. I will note at this point that I am unfortunately going to a meeting at the White House right now, and so Senator Markey or Senator Nelson has very kindly agreed to chair the remainder of.
I'm going to chair the remainder.
Okay, so one or the other will chair, and I'll let them fight it out as to who gets the gavel. But I appreciate both of their willingness to chair, and I apologize that this conflict arose just a couple of hours ago, and so being unable to be in two places at once.
Mr. Chairman, you might not want me to chair because we might, by the time you got back, already have passed a NASA bill.
I have faith we will continue to work together in a bipartisan manner to get that done. And I want to thank each of the witnesses. I think this hearing has already been productive, and I'm sure there will be continued and very positive discussion going forward. So thank you for being here. And with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Markey.
And